not sure I can focus this question down to a fine point, but I've been thinking a lot about coaching recently, and you've mentioned it a few times. And a lot of what you've presented, as would be true of somebody who was presenting on what a good student-led classroom would be, or any other aspect of school life. And we're starting a new school, so we have all of these different components, and we've studied what best practices are, tried to inform ourselves what they are. And certainly going to workshops is one way to instill some of those best practices into a culture. But again and again, whether it's a workshop on teaching or advisories or whatever it is, really to have it infused, become part of a culture, it needs intentionality across the board. It needs a coach. So I'm beginning to wonder whether we should have a series of coaches, because to prepare well for an advisory, as you just said, takes time. To prepare really well for a class takes a lot of time. To assess student learning takes time. To assess faculty teaching takes time. Do you have any sort of macro views of all of that? Because if we really wanted to instill a culture that crosses over all of those different components, I don't know, we need some culture czars around. Constantly sort of floating around the school, sort of keeping people's minds focused on the right thing.
I agree with you. One way to think about it is if we dedicate 30 minutes a day, I think that we just dedicated 8% of our total time to advisories. I mean,
but the preparation for them.
There's no question that if we were to do that in any other curriculum strand, as we already know,
right.
We have a head of that strand that is there primarily for assisting the whole school in that particular area. And so if we're devoting that much time to this, which I would support we do, I think we ought to think about, is there a head of advisory? Now, they're a player coach,
right.
You know, in the same way that, you know, all of our curriculum strands are, but it would make a lot of, and I would assume you all, don't you advocate that? Or not?
I mean, I think we're seeing that all over the country, that embedded coaching is what's understood to be useful. You know, sending people out to workshops is okay, but unless they're supported and they're getting feedback. Feedback is where it happens. Just like on the athletic field, right? People get better because the coach gives them good feedback and they implement it.
Yeah, and then just basically the way we're talking about advisory, the idea of 18 students potentially sitting around a table or in a circle, what our classes are going to look like, and for the most part in high school anyway. And so establishing that culture is only going to also reinforce the everyday classes that students engage.
But is that your point? Is that the point you're making, though?
No, my point is that if we have certain basic goals and objectives for how we want pedagogy to be structured and what we want teachers to do in classrooms, you know, not being too prescriptive, but having some pretty clear ideas about outcomes. And if we have some ideas about advisories, and if we have some ideas about evaluation and supervision of teachers, assessment of teachers, and on, I think you need to be very intentional about that. And so you need, and I just don't think going to a workshop is going to do it.
Right.
So and it takes a lot of time. So if we're going to have successful advisories, as sort of saying what Chris says, you know, there's the advisory itself, which takes time, but planning that advisory takes time.
You're going to have teachers who naturally have this skill of being really good content area teachers and possess this, I don't want to say psychology or counseling, but youth work kind of thing. And they're going to do some amazing things in advisory where naturally they will become your teacher leaders, where they may rise to the occasion of helping plan and helping teachers think through the advisory as a team. And then there's something else here that I see, and that is this idea of accountability. If we go back to what Avenues hope for, the question becomes then, what is that kind of teacher? And I think that gets at, that's when I am not afraid of accountability, because at New City School, I'm very clear about what kind of teacher it takes to progress the particular curriculum that I've given my whole life over to and sweat. So I'm clear about what that teacher is, and added to that is that maybe developing inside of their contract, inside of whatever you want to, is what I call teacher social emotional competencies. And that's where, at one point, where leadership want teachers to understand that this advisory is very important, and that there will be people who will assess teachers around that idea if the mission around that social emotional and kids being connected is, if that's happening. And so there's the two questions, the two kind of things is going on. One is that natural leader who will take place and how you begin to leverage that particular person. And then two, that you're after a particular teacher to care for, nurture, and teach these particular kids and nurture them through the grade level. And who are the person who will be responsible for making sure that that happened and that particular level.